Why are you always attracted to people who hurt you? This situation, whether in real life or fictional arts like movies and literature, is quite common and resonates strongly with our emotions. It often involves a pure and kind-hearted protagonist who becomes helplessly enamored with a morally corrupt, selfish, and despicable person. Consequently, they are repeatedly deceived, used, and even abandoned by the latter. In artistic works, the protagonist is often depicted as female to intensify the tragedy's conflict and tension. At the same time, the unfortunate victim sometimes bitterly jokes about having a natural attraction to scum. Does this concept of inherent attraction to problematic individuals exist in the world? Some explain this phenomenon simplistically, attributing it to those who are naive, lack romantic experience, or are newly entering a society unaware of its treacherous aspects. However, in real life, we find even mature, successful individuals with rich emotional histories falling into this emotional trap and unable to extricate themselves from it. This led some psychologists to consider whether this common emotional tragedy is due to a fixed psychological, behavioral pattern in those involved. The author of this book, Rosenberg, is a psychotherapist with nearly 35 years of experience specializing in psychological trauma and addiction. He runs his counseling and therapy center in Chicago and is also a popular figure in psychology education on the internet. His videos on psychological education regarding intimate relationships have garnered over 26 million views worldwide. Through decades of research and clinical experience, Rosenberg developed the concept discussed in this book, the human magnet syndrome. So, what exactly is the human magnet syndrome? In a word, it's a seemingly ordinary but mutually torturous intimate relationship between two genders. The primary victims are those with low self-esteem and self-worth, who continuously endure setbacks and sufferings in personal relationships but persist in infatuation and pursuit of those who harm them. These perpetrators of harm typically share a common trait: they excel in some aspects, but possess a narcissistic personality. They are accustomed to manipulating their partners in intimate relationships. Furthermore, this phenomenon frequently occurs because the manipulator and the victim attract each other like the positive and negative poles of a magnet. They recognize each other amidst the vast population and jointly create this symbiotic relationship filled with harm but challenging to break free from. If you are familiar with the gaslight effect, you might have a foundational understanding of the intricacies of this carefully constructed manipulative relationship. However, the book Gaslight Effect does not explain the origin of the personality and behavioral patterns of the victim and the manipulator in such abnormal intimate relationships, nor does it explain why the manipulator has an enduring influence over the victim. You must have developed a considerable interest in the content of this book. So, let's split it into two parts to introduce the book's main content. First, examine the victims and perpetrators in the human magnet syndrome. What are their respective personality traits and behavioral patterns, and why do they possess that uncontrollable yet deadly attraction to each other? Secondly, following Rosenberg's narrative, let's explore why the tragedy of both victims and perpetrators can be traced back to their early family upbringing and environment. In the concluding section, I'll summarize the book's essence and focus and briefly introduce Rosenberg's tailored psychological recovery plan for the victims. At the beginning of this book, the author Rosenberg does not hesitate to speak from his own experience, stating that he is, in fact, a severe victim of the human magnet syndrome. This led him through 2 failed marriages, a knowledge that caused him immense mental and emotional exhaustion. It was during this excruciating pain that Rosenberg conceived the idea of self-diagnosis and treatment through psychological research. The inspiration for this concept came from a friend who told Rosenberg, "I've noticed that every woman you fall in love with is the same person, just with a different face." This sarcastic comment from his friend acted as a wake-up call for Rosenberg. During the following period, Rosenberg simultaneously refined his theory of the human magnet syndrome while retrospectively analyzing his 2 failed marriages. He concluded that when he encountered both of his ex-partners, he found them charming and believed them to be perfect partners. However, in reality, they all had narcissistic personalities, with a desire for control in their marital lives, disregarding Rosenberg's emotional needs. As mentioned earlier, the human magnet syndrome is an imbalanced, intimate, emotional relationship. Rosenberg categorizes the parties involved into two. The weaker victim is termed the codependent, while the dominant manipulator is labeled the narcissistic controller. Codependent individuals possess low self-esteem and low self-worth. They are usually attracted and committed to the long-term relationship with the dark charm of the narcissistic controller. They firmly believe that leaving such a relationship equates losing their sense of self and worth. Codependents are incredibly selfless in intimate relationships, unconditionally catering to their partner's needs and desires, often exhibiting almost pathological levels of responsibility and sacrificial spirit. Unfortunately, their efforts and sacrifices seldom receive gratitude or reciprocation from their partner, the narcissistic controller. On the other hand, narcissistic controllers possess specific personality traits: narcissism, selfishness, a belief in their entitlement to special treatment, coupled with indifference, a lack of concern for others' needs, and difficulty empathizing. In 2002, psychologists Paul Hess and Williams introduced the concept of the dark triad personality, which includes being goal-oriented at any cost, extreme narcissism, indulgence in thrill-seeking behavior, and a lack of empathy. Those exhibiting this unhealthy personality overlap significantly with Rosenberg's description of the narcissistic controller. In both reality and various artistic works, many successful individuals and notorious criminals fall under the categories of narcissistic controllers or possess traits of the dark triad. You might wonder why these codependents continuously admire and rely on the so-called scum, the selfish and manipulative controllers. Rosenberg explains that the personalities and emotional needs of both parties form an unhealthy but compelling complement, akin to the saying willing to beat and willing to suffer. Rosenberg cites the example of the famous couple John Dillinger and his girlfriend Billie Frechette, known as one of the prototypes for the main characters in the renowned Hollywood gangster movie, Bonnie and Clyde. Dillinger, a notorious bank robber in the 1920s and 1930s, was flamboyant and even engaged in gun battles with the police in broad daylight, distributing his loot to strangers, portraying himself as a villainous hero in the eyes of many due to the context of the Great Depression, where banks were seen as symbols of greed and evil. On the other hand, Billie came from an unfortunate background and consistently chose boyfriends with criminal records, making Dillinger's rebellious persona incredibly appealing to her. Rosenberg identifies her as a typical codependent, being fascinated with Dillinger's arrogance, intelligence, and disregard for societal laws. Rosenberg asserts that if codependents or narcissistic controllers were to encounter psychologically normal individuals, their pathological behavior would undoubtedly evoke discomfort and repulsion, drastically reducing the chances of forming an intimate relationship. However, in the eyes of codependents, the overpowering self-confidence, appealing appearance, eloquence, and commanding behavior of the narcissistic controller successfully trigger their submissive, sacrificial desires. In essence, only such a powerful, charismatic, selfish partner can ultimately bring out the codependent's pride in their empathy, dedication, and sacrificial capabilities. The continuous demands of the narcissistic controller are perceived as symbols of love and value to the codependent. Simultaneously, the narcissistic controller keeps reinforcing their sense of worth and control through the continuous affirmation they receive. Once an intimate relationship forms, both parties adopt their familiar roles, feeling a sense of comfort and ease, which significantly contributes to the magnetic force that binds the codependent and narcissistic controller together. Rosenberg even likens this relationship to drug addiction, where initially, both parties feel immense pleasure. However, emotional tolerance begins to show as time passes, necessitating more stimuli to maintain the same level of joy. This explains why both parties involuntarily seek the roller coaster of emotional abuse and affection in such unhealthy relationships. Today, many idle dramas and online novels are inundated with similar storylines, frequent conflicts and quarrels between the main characters and exaggerated actions due to various misunderstandings and contradictions, including self-harm and breakups. Subsequently, usually, the male character, after realizing one mistake, excessively indulges and shows affection towards the female character, driving the plot into the next repetitive cycle. As the relationship deepens, particularly for the codependent, due to the selfish betrayal and manipulation of the partner, thoughts of ending the relationship arise, leading to withdrawal symptoms akin to drug addiction. Just the thought of leaving the partner signifies the loss of emotional anchor and comfort zone, plunging into immense loneliness and panic. Ultimately, whether codependents or narcissistic controllers, most tend to choose to endure, unable to voluntarily break away from such relationships. In the book, Rosenberg cited a real-life case to illustrate his points. He once had a patient named Teresa, who was a severely symptomatic dependent codependent. After 9 months of treatment, she finally divorced her abusive and narcissistic husband. However, 6 months later, Teresa announced her desire to pause the treatment because she felt healed and wanted to start a new relationship. Despite Rosenberg's strong reservations, he couldn't stop her. Just 8 months later, Teresa returned to seek Rosenberg's help again. She looked as sad as she did when she started the treatment. She confessed she couldn't resist signing up for a dating website to find a new partner. She met Jonathan, who seemed handsome and cheerful and had a stable job. Initially, Teresa thought Jonathan was her knight in shining armor, but their first date became their last. Despite Jonathan being perfect on paper, Teresa couldn't summon the stormy, passionate love she had hoped for. Feeling exhausted and hopeless after a 2-hour conversation, Teresa made excuses and hurriedly left. Feeling defeated, Teresa decided to continue searching for someone who could trigger the feeling she sought. She found Chad, a classic bad boy and ladies' man. Despite Chad's profile indicating he was job hunting, Teresa couldn't resist his charm. After their first restaurant date, they fell deeply in love. Teresa described the attraction as magnetic, feeling unable to escape even if she wanted to. However, Chad soon revealed his true colors: selfish, temperamental, and alcoholic, just like Teresa's ex-husband. Left with no choice, Teresa had to end this relationship too, feeling hurt and ashamed abruptly. Returning to Rosenberg, she shared her story to highlight a cautionary note about romanticized love stories in reality and classic literature. Rosenberg further delved into the reasons behind individuals becoming codependents or dark, selfish narcissistic controllers. He attributed their roots to the crucial developmental stages during infancy and childhood, where they were unfortunately exposed to abnormal, love-deprived environments. Rosenberg highlighted the intergenerational transmission of behaviors and psychological trauma, linking it to a concept he termed emotional relay baton. Reflecting on his own family history, Rosenberg revealed how his father, Earl, possessed a solid narcissistic personality due to his upbringing in a love-deprived environment, having been neglected by his parents. Earl's behavior affected his relationships, leading to his irresponsible and womanizing tendencies. With her lack of love and attention from her parents, Rosenberg's mother, Muriel, became a people pleaser, aiming to please others at the cost of her own needs. Rosenberg painfully recalled how he grew up in a dysfunctional family environment, constantly vying for his father's attention and feeling deep shame whenever Earl overlooked him. This need for approval and constant attempts to please his father shaped Rosenberg's behaviors and choices, ultimately leading to his struggles with drug addiction and eventual rehabilitation. Rosenberg linked his family's dynamics directly to the interpersonal magnet syndrome, illustrating how his family members perfectly fit into the roles of narcissistic controllers and dependent codependents. He concluded that these unhealthy relationship patterns were passed down through generations and ultimately landed in his hands. Specifically, how are personality traits and behavior patterns inherited across generations in a deprived nurturing environment? In a childhood devoid of care, infants and young children strive for their survival, even if subjected to intentional or unintentional neglect and abuse from parents. They tend to rationalize and normalize this neglect and abuse. Additionally, children often mimic their parents' language and behavioral patterns, aiming for an identity alignment with their parents. This is because imitation and identification are direct ways of expressing love. A girl growing up in her original family environment experiencing paternal violence and abuse might, in adulthood, develop an attraction to a man exhibiting traits similar to her father, violent and oppressive. For instance, Rosenberg's traits as a codependent stem from his mother. In this book, Rosenberg specifically analyzes how codependents and narcissistic controllers are nurtured and inherited within an unhealthy family atmosphere. Let's begin with codependence. Rosenberg points out that if children receive sufficient and appropriate love and attention from their parents, trust in others and proactive autonomy would become the foundation of their personalities. However, in cases where this doesn't occur due to a lack of awareness or due to inherent narcissistic tendencies, many parents fail at this crucial stage. Consequently, children don't experience love and security within the family environment, hindering the establishment of a healthy personality. Unluckily, for children with a fragile and dependent nature, the ability to harmonize with their parents' selfish behaviors becomes a survival skill. They engage in active compliance with their parents' manipulative fantasies to gain as much attention and care as possible. This pattern inadvertently causes a child to become codependent. Externally, many parents might consider their children to be highly successful and take pride in them. This is because, during childhood and adolescence, codependents often present themselves as model children, quick to understand and adapt to the slightest emotional changes in their parents, always striving to excel in various aspects as required by their parents, and always smiling to please them. However, these children often hide their genuine emotions and feelings, apologizing excessively for fear of punishment. The codependent develops an overwhelming sense of familiarity with narcissistic controllers, feeling a deep and pathological sense of familiarity in this relationship. This compels them to replicate entrenched relationship patterns from their childhood with their narcissistic parents. On the other hand, narcissistic controllers, in some sense, are opposite to dependent codependents. During childhood, they are often perceived as troublesome and disobedient children by narcissistic parents who struggle with the child's defiance against their delusional and overly high expectations. Narcissistic parents project their feelings of shame and failure onto their children, making them scapegoats for their inadequacies. This continuous cycle of insult and abuse prompts the child to develop a defense mechanism of dissociation, detaching themselves from reality to escape their hostile environment. To cope with the pain caused by abuse, these children gradually disconnect from their emotions and adopt selfish and manipulative ways to interact with others. They create a fantasy that they are essential and that their suffering is evidence of their significance. This upbringing leads them to carry narcissistic tendencies deep within their personalities. Hence, Rosenberg concludes that codependents and narcissistic controllers consider each other soulmates due to a profound and pathological sense of familiarity. Their unconscious familiarity drives them to reenact deeply ingrained relationship patterns from their childhood with their narcissistic parents. At the end of this book, Rosenberg briefly mentions his self-developed self-love recovery therapy, which consists of 10 steps primarily aimed at helping those who are unable to break free from codependency. So here, I'll roughly outline it for you. The first stage is called rock bottom, which, as the name suggests, is the most painful and darkest stage for codependents. They have been trapped in the interpersonal magnet syndrome for a long time, fed up with being manipulated and harmed by the other party. But at the same time, this is also an opportunity for a rebound. Once they can muster the courage to seek help from friends or even professional psychological counseling institutions, it marks an important first step. Next, codependents begin to receive psychological therapy and counseling, gradually understanding the interpersonal magnet syndrome, as well as their own characteristics and nature as codependents. In therapy, they gradually realize that their low self-esteem and sense of worthlessness are incorrect and that the so-called intimate relationship is not a manifestation of love. The third stage is quite painful, akin to forced withdrawal in drug rehabilitation. Rosenberg explains that the most important thing for patients in this stage is to maintain solitude. Many codependents cannot bear the loneliness in their hearts or the craving for the manipulator, sneaking out to reconnect with the manipulator's ex-partner or find a similar replacement, thereby undermining their progress. If patients successfully withstand this period of solitude, treatment enters the fourth stage, akin to early rehabilitation after surgery. In this stage, psychological counselors further explain the mentality of narcissistic manipulators and their means of control. Then, with the help of the counselor, codependents gradually start some simulation exercises to distinguish between the needs of a normal partner and the emotional manipulation and extortion of a narcissist. In the following fifth and sixth stages, the patient's psychological recovery will gradually deepen, entering into deeper waters. During these 3 stages, patients need to learn to set boundaries for their legitimate interests and to face the threats and coercion of manipulators firmly. Once they have learned these, the next task is to confront their hidden psychological traumas and, under the guidance of professional psychological counselors, gradually abandon their original psychological reaction paths through practice and establish entirely new and healthy ones. Then they can completely detach themselves from their subconscious low-value, low-esteem selves and learn how to love themselves. Finally, after resetting to factory settings, patients can independently attempt to restore social relationships and establish a completely new, equal, and healthy intimate relationship. Additionally, in Chapter 5 of this book, Rosenberg thoughtfully provides readers with a psychological pattern self-assessment questionnaire, akin to an extended personality spectrum. The extreme left end represents severe codependents, while the extreme right end represents complete narcissistic manipulators. The comparatively healthy normal pattern lies in the middle. You can use the detailed description of this questionnaire to assess your psychological state and personality type in intimate relationships, as well as to understand which type of personality would best complement yours, fostering normal resonance and intimacy.